So yes, you read that title correctly. California plans to reissue the 17,000 non-domiciled CDLs that it was supposed to cancel on January 6th. Hey guys, welcome back to another video, and we're going to be talking about this today. Now, this started out as a rumor that was sent to me by someone who does not want to be named, but apparently had contact with an official source. So I heard about this rumor actually at the beginning of the week. I started posting about it just here and there on X a few days ago. And then on Thursday, December 18th, FreightWaves released an article that we are going to be talking about today. Ready? Let's go. So as always, this being an educational channel, the first order of business is always going to be to make sure that we are all on the same page, especially when it comes to something like non-domiciled CDLs, because there is a ton of confusion there. Are states issuing them? Is the pause in effect? According to the courts, are states even allowed to issue them? Oh boy, there is a lot to unpack here. So let's go through it really quickly. At the end of September, the FMCSA issued an interim final rule saying that no more non-domiciled CDLs unless they meet the new criteria, right? Some limited visa types, work authorizations no longer work. Then a lawsuit was filed against the FMCSA, and the court issued a temporary pause, basically saying that while the lawsuit is ongoing, states are allowed to continue issuing those non-domiciled CDLs, processing them like they did before the interim final rule. So the pause basically tells states, yeah, just continue doing what you were doing while we try to figure it out. Then the FMCSA asked the court to pause the lawsuit because the FMCSA said that they opened it up to a comment period, which ended at the end of November, and that they would probably release a final rule that is slightly different, amended to the original interim final rule. The court agreed, however, the pause is still there, which means that yes, in theory, states can continue issuing and processing non-domiciled CDLs the way they did before the interim final rule came out, which changed who is allowed to get a non-domiciled CDL. However, that's not exactly what happened. Most states, not all of them, but most states decided, you know what, we're going to continue pausing the issuance or processing of non-domiciled CDLs until there is more of a framework or something more concrete that comes from the courts, because they don't want to, DMVs and states, they don't want to go like back and forth, right? It costs money, it costs time. So they decided, you know what, we're pausing the issuance of non-domiciled CDLs or processing them until the court comes out with a concrete, or the FMCSA comes out with a concrete rule that everyone can start following. Some states have decided to completely cancel the non-domiciled CDL program, and it is their right? Like the state of Nevada, for example, canceled it. There is no way to get a non-domiciled CDL anymore in the state of Nevada. Now, the topic of confusion. Despite the fact that the court said that, yeah, all of you guys can continue issuing and processing non-domiciled CDLs while we try to figure this out, there were some states that were placed on corrective action by the FMCSA due to the amount of fraud discovered during the audit. One of those states was the state of California, which means that California, regardless of what the court says, California is absolutely banned from processing anything to do with non-domiciled CDLs at the moment, regardless of the court's decision, until they come into compliance with the FMCSA and make sure that there is no fraud going on. Now, California, together with other states, was facing significant financial damage if they didn't shape up. The FMCSA told them that if you do not start cleaning up your system, you are going to be at risk of losing $150 million in federal highway funding. Following this threat, California, of course, did an internal audit, and they themselves found that 17,000 of the 65,000 non-domiciled CDLs that were issued in the states were issued with the incorrect expiration date. We have talked about this, and on November 6th, California sent out notices to 17,000 people saying that within 60 days, your CDL is going to be canceled, right? So 60 days expires on January 6th. Now, some context. Just last week, Secretary Sean Duffy came out and did a press conference regarding New York. They did an audit in New York, and the findings were pretty bad. They found that 53% of the non-domiciled CDLs that were issued in New York were issued unlawfully. And what I'm talking about here is that many of them, the DMV didn't even check the presence of the person, like at all, work authorization, nothing, nothing. They didn't ask for anything. They just automatically issued an 8-year CDL. And even if they did check the lawful presence of an applicant, they issued an 8-year CDL, even if the work authorization, for example, expired in a month. Now, in that same press conference, Sean Duffy actually praised California because he was asked a question about why did California not get all of its funding pulled? And he said because California did an internal audit and they did find where the issue lies, and they are revoking those 17,000 improperly issued CDLs, the FMCSA decided not to pull that funding. But it looks like California just changed their mind. So according to FreightWaves, state transportation officials confirmed to sources that the DMV will begin restoring the contested licenses to immigrant drivers who received 60-day cancellation notices on November 6th. The state has not clarified the specific process, but points to the DC Circuit Court's November 13th emergency stay of the FMCSA's interim final rule restricting non-domiciled CDL eligibility. Basically, California is saying, well, the court paused this rule, so that's why we're doing it. Now, as the article states, California must be very confused because the court's temporary stay of the rule, also known as the pause of the interim final rule, does not apply to California because the FMCSA found that 25% of California's non-domiciled CDLs were improperly issued, and they put this state under corrective action before any interim final rule came out. Yes, California has been under corrective action before the September 29th interim final rule came out. Quote, California remains subject to a corrective action plan addressing these pre-existing violations. The court's stay doesn't change that. FMCSA's November 13th guidance was explicit. States subject to a corrective action plan must maintain their pauses on non-domiciled CDL issuance until demonstrating compliance with pre-rule regulations. Now, how did California even arrive at the decision that, you know what, yeah, we were thinking of revoking those improperly issued CDLs, but now we're actually going to reissue those 17,000 CDLs? Well, they claimed that the mismatched dates on those licenses are more clerical errors rather than actual violations, and that the work authorizations of these applicants remain valid. They further believe that since there was a pause by the court, California can now correct the mismatching dates and reissue compliant credentials. But once again, California is forgetting a couple of things. The reason California is under corrective action is not because a lot of the CDLs that were issued had a mismatched date. The FMCSA found gross negligence when it comes to issuing CDLs in California, non-domiciled CDLs in California, issuing CDLs to people who were not supposed to get them at all, right? People who are not eligible for a non-domiciled CDL. And plus, to top it all off, that corrective action, again, it came before the interim final rule was released. So California was in hot water before this whole thing about non-domiciled CDLs started. So what now? Well, now, for a lack of a better word, it's going to be the battle of the titans, the FMCSA versus the state of California. Now, I personally look at everything from the standpoint of psychology. This is something that really interests me. For those of you who are new to this channel, in university, I studied psychology with a focus on abnormal psychology, actually, but psychology in general, that's what I have my bachelor's degree in. And considering my interest in psychology, of course, I'm looking at it from a little bit of a different lens. And considering the fact that just last week, Secretary Duffy was somewhat praising California for the fact that they are actually doing something about the issues that were found by the FMCSA, and for California to just less than a week later confirmed that actually, no, we're going to reissue everything. From a psychological standpoint, I think we can expect quite the response from the FMCSA. There's always the threat, of course, of pulling more federal funding, but then there are also those nuclear options. I'm going to quote this. If FMCSA determines that California's reissued licenses don't comply with federal regulations, thousands of drivers could face the same uncertainty all over again, potentially worse. We're talking about non-domiciled CDL drivers, but we're also talking about those who have a domiciled CDL in California. I'll explain in a second. The nuclear options are simple. Other states might just simply refuse to recognize California credentials, or the FMCSA has the option always to move towards decertification. Decertification of a state is really a nuclear option, because if California is no longer allowed to issue any CDLs, it doesn't affect a certain group of people. It affects anyone who is in California. And that means that renewals cannot happen in California, which means that you now have to move to a nearby state to get your CDL, because when you get your CDL, you usually have to prove that you are a resident of that state. So yeah, this is very interesting. Now, Rob Carpenter of FreightWaves actually believes that the idea of decertification in California is not far-fetched at all, considering the amount of back and forth that has been happening over the months between the FMCSA and the state of California. I'm anticipating that we are going to see a lot of heated conversations, heated press conferences, and a lot of announcements from the FMCSA regarding the state of California in the coming weeks. Basically, it's going to be an interesting ride when it comes to the news. And just so you guys know, again, I'm going to repeat myself here. If California does get decertified, it influences everyone, because it doesn't matter what kind of CDL you have, you will have to get a CDL from a different state. You will just not be able to renew, at least the way the law is written right now. Decertification was actually never used, as far as I know, in the history of the FMCSA. However, based on the wording of the law and regulation right now, yeah, if a state gets decertified, you have to get your CDL from a different state, which again means that you have to prove that you are a resident of that state. And something tells me, after seeing the back and forth, after following this news closely, after using my psychological juju or interest when trying to figure out where people stand, yeah, something tells me that Rob Carpenter of FreightWaves is correct. Decertification is not just on the table, it is a very, very real possibility. Anyway, guys, just trying to keep you updated on the news of this industry. Let me know what you think. Wishing you all a fantastic weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, and keep learning. See you in the next video.